He never thought his life would turn out like this. He never imagined that at this age, he would be going back to school. But before he could even think about that, chaos unfolded before him. A powerful attack came from the sky, striking the ground with force of the building below. The explosion sent shock waves through the air. In the midst of the destruction, a boy stood tall, holding a sword in his hand. His reflection shone in the eyes of the monster standing before him. The monster saw him approaching and roared loudly, showing no fear. But the boy did not hesitate. With a swift and powerful movement, he slashed his sword, cutting through the monster's body with ease. His strikes were so strong that the creature was split into several pieces, its remains falling to the ground. When the battle was over, the boy turned around. His gaze fell on several figures walking toward him. At that moment, a smile appeared on his face. These people were his friends, something he never expected. He never thought he would fight alongside them, but here they were, standing together. Meanwhile, heavy rain poured down from the sky, soaking the land below. In the distance, a glorious castle stood tall, but inside chaos raged. Flames spread throughout the rooms, consuming everything in their path. Inside the burning castle, 4 figures stood apart, separated by the raging flames. On one side, a boy with black hair stood protectively in front of 2 girls, shielding them from danger. His expression was serious, his stance firm. On the other side, a boy held a knife tightly in his hand, his eyes focused on the black-haired boy. The tension between them was thick, like the smoke filling the air. The black-haired boy looked at his opponent and asked why he was trying so hard to stop them. His voice was strong, filled with frustration. The boy with the knife had already given his answer. He warned them not to go any further. His tone was calm but firm, carrying an unspoken threat. He knew the person standing before him was Taylor McClure, the protagonist of this story. But Taylor did not care about his warning. His eyes burned with determination as he ignored the words and stepped forward. Without hesitation, he lunged at the boy, his voice ringing through the fiery room as he shouted the name of his opponent, that was Ed Roth Taylor. Ed, however, remained calm. Even as Taylor's attack approached, he did not flinch. Instead, he quietly cast a spell called Ignition with sharp eyes. Instantly, glowing flames rose around him, spreading heat through the already burning castle. The fire crackled and surged, creating a wall of destruction. But Taylor did not back down. Ed took out a bow and aimed at Taylor, who was charging toward him. His hands were steady, his eyes locked on his target. Ed was nothing more than a third-rate villain in this story, a character meant to be forgotten, a nobody who barely appeared. In the original story, he was destined to be useless, someone who did not matter. But a third-rate character could still choose their own path. Instead of aiming at Taylor, Ed suddenly shifted his bow, pointing it toward one of the girls behind him. Before they could react, Ed released the arrow. The sharp projectile flew through the air and struck the girl. A gasp of pain escaped her lips as she staggered back. At the same time, Taylor's sword found its mark, stabbing deep into Ed's body. Blood dripped from the wound, but Ed did not scream. He did not even show pain. Instead, a small smile appeared on his lips. It was not the smile of a hero or someone seeking understanding. He did not need anyone to understand him. He was not trying to be the protagonist of this story. He had made his choice, and he would follow it to the end. Taylor's anger boiled at the sight of Ed's smile. To him, it was nothing but mockery, as if Ed was laughing at him even in death. But Ed was not a hero. He was a third-rate villain. If he wanted to reach the end of this story, he had only one goal: survival. The flames around them continued to burn, the storm outside raged on. Ed Roth Taylor sat in a luxurious room, holding a letter in his hands. His eyes moved over the words written inside, listing all the sins he had committed. He read about how he had used dirty words in front of the princess, interfered in the entrance examination of the Holy Sylvania Academy, and many other offenses. As he reached the end of the letter, a bitter feeling grew inside him. He wondered if his family had finally removed his name from the family register. It felt as if fate itself was mocking him. His life as a noble was over. The moment of his downfall arrived when a boy threw his luggage to the ground and looked at him without sympathy. He spoke with a firm voice and told Ed that these were all his belongings, then coldly thanked him for his hard work all this time. There was no warmth in those words, only finality. Ed was no longer part of the Roth Taylor family. He had nothing left. As news of his disgrace spread, people whispered about him. Some were glad to see him fall, while others remained afraid of him because of his bad reputation. He had once been known for arrogance and cruelty, and even now, some still feared what he might do. However, among all those voices, there was one who spoke there was nothing to fear. Ed Roth Taylor's misfortune did not end with being kicked out of his family. He even lost his place in the dormitory. When another student heard the news, a little anticipation mixed with disappointment. With a sigh, he asked if this meant he would not be seen in the next semester. He admitted to himself that he should not have cheated on the entrance examination in first place. With nowhere to go, he found himself sitting at a desk in the garden, his only belongings packed into 2 bags beside him. He was filled with sadness and frustration. It felt unfair. The arrogant Ed Roth Taylor that everyone talked about was not him. People saw him as a spoiled noble, but in truth, that was not who he really was. Deep inside, he carried a secret that no one else could understand. He was not the real Ed Roth Taylor. He was a modern human who had somehow entered into a game he knew very well. The world around him was not just reality but the setting of his favorite game, the failed swordsman of the Sylvania. This was a game based on the magic school, Sylvania Academy, and now, he was living inside it. When someone enters a game world, they usually become someone powerful and a rich chaebol heir, a genius young master from a ruffian clan, or even an SSS rank hunter who breaks all the rules. But out of all the possible characters he could have been, Ed Roth Taylor had become the worst one. He was nothing more than a third-rate villain who got kicked out of the dormitory at the very beginning of the game. He had arrived in the worst situation possible, and there was nothing exciting or powerful about it. Frustration built up inside him until he could not hold it in anymore. He shouted out in anger, complaining about how unfair his situation was. He had always lived simply, never being greedy, never asking for more than he needed. He did not deserve this. But as the people around him listened, they were shocked. After everything he had done in the past, after all the trouble he had caused, how could he still call this unfair? To them, it sounded ridiculous, even shameless. He could do nothing but stay silent, holding on to his pride while the people around him gave up and walked away, leaving him alone in his misery. Later, Ed looked at his reflection in the mirror, and what he saw shocked him. His stats were worse than he had expected. He wondered if they were real, but the numbers did not lie. He was a student in the magic faculty, yet his intellect stat was crawling on the floor. His stamina was embarrassingly low, not even suitable for a nobleman. It was no surprise that he had been nothing more than a third-rate villain, a minor character who appeared only in the early parts of the game. Frustration filled him as he tried to recall more about Ed Roth Taylor's character. But his memory was blurry. He could not remember much about what was supposed to happen to him next. That only made things worse because it meant he had no way of knowing how to change his fate. Then, suddenly, a memory from the game surfaced in his mind. In the corner of the ending credits, he had once seen Ed's fate. He had not died, but his life had become miserable. By the end of the game, Ed Roth Taylor had become nothing more than a beggar, a tramp with no future. There was no surprise. The ruffian who knew nothing about the world was suddenly thrown into streets, so he was lucky he was even alive. Ed let out a deep sigh, wondering why he had ended up in this body. He did not know the reason, and honestly, he did not even care to find out. What mattered now was survival. He tightened his grip on the bags in both hands, his sharp eyes filled with determination. He refused to accept the miserable fate that was waiting for him. He would not let that be his ending. No matter what, he would try his best to change his destiny. Sylvania Academy was more than just a school. It was as large as a city, with the entire Arkan region and its surrounding mountains included in its premises. It was a vast and complicated place, and Ed knew that if he wanted to avoid trouble, he needed to find somewhere to hide. In the northeast part of the academy, there was an untouched forest, a place rarely visited by students. That was where he ended up after walking for half a day, escaping the judgmental stares and whispers of the students. As he sat on his bag in the quiet wilderness, he finally understood just how desperate his situation was. His expulsion was not just a minor event, it was the true beginning of the game's extreme survival scenario. Ed felt exhausted, his entire face covered in sweat from the long walk. His body ached, and his mind was heavy with thoughts about his uncertain future. But despite everything, he found a small piece of relief. Although his family had expelled him, he had not been expelled from Sylvania Academy. That alone gave him hope. Sylvania Academy was not just any school, it was one of the top academies in the world. In the game, it was said that anyone who graduated from here was guaranteed a secure future. If he could somehow manage to stay, he might still have a chance at success. Even more importantly, as long as the game setting remained inside the academy, he had an advantage. He can use the intel of a 5-time dedicated player of the game to its fullest. That means if he just graduate quietly, he could not only survive but even live comfortably, perhaps even better than his previous life. Ed's goal was now clear: he had to graduate from Sylvania Academy. However, there was one big problem standing in his way: the tuition fees. This semester's fees had already been paid, so he did not need to worry about that for now. But next semester was a different story. He thought about the possibility of getting a scholarship, but with his pathetic stats, it seemed nearly impossible. He could only hope that somehow he would not fail. For now, he decided to push the problem of tuition fees aside. He had a more urgent issue to deal with: his basic needs. Before worrying about next semester, he had to find a way to survive. He needed food, clothing, and shelter. If he did not take care of these things, he would not even last a week. At least for now, he still had enough clothes in his suitcase to last him for a while. Ed's most immediate concern beyond finding food and shelter was also the place to stay. He had no protection from the cold nights, and without a steady food source, surviving would be difficult. Normally, someone in his situation could try to find a job, but because of his terrible reputation, no one would be willing to hire him. His past actions had made him infamous, and people wanted nothing to do with him. Going back to the dormitory was also impossible since he had been officially expelled. That meant he had only one option: that he had to stay in the forest for now. It was not an ideal situation, but at least there was a stream nearby where he could get drinking water. That was a small relief in an otherwise difficult time. He had 10 days before the new semester started, and during that time, he needed to survive and prepare himself. His weak stats meant he was far behind his classmates, and if he wanted to have any chance at success, he had to train himself. So, standing alone in the forest, Ed began practicing magic. He continuously chanted Wind Blade. Each time he cast it, the wind swirled around him, cutting the woods. It was exhausting, and his body was not built for such intense training. But despite everything, he found a small reason to be grateful: that at least he could still use magic. Ed was shocked by how weak his body was. After cutting down just 15 tree trunks with magic, he felt like he was going to die from exhaustion. The hunger made everything feel even worse, and frustration built up inside him. He started to wonder if using magic was the reason he felt so weak and hungry. As his stomach growled in protest, he said his family feed him before they kick him out. Then, out of nowhere, an old memory surfaced in his mind. He remembered something his grandfather once told him when he was a child. His grandfather had lived through difficult times, and when he was young and starving, he had no choice but to eat tree bark from the mountains to survive. Ed sat in front of the tree trunk, staring at it with desperation. He had no food. With no other choice, he decided to try boiling the tree trunk using the ignition spell. After heating the wood, he took a closer look at it. The texture reminded him of chicken breast, which gave him a little hope. Maybe it would not be so bad. Without thinking too much, he took a bite and started chewing. However, the moment the taste hit his tongue, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. For the next 3 days, he suffered. The first day, he starved. The second and third days, he vomited repeatedly, his stomach unable to handle the wood he had eaten. His entire body felt weak, and he regretted his decision. In the end, he came to a simple but important conclusion: that the wood was completely useless as food. Instead of trying to eat it, he should use it to build a shelter. Ed knew that to build a proper shelter, he needed to raise a sturdy frame to support the wooden structure. However, this was easier said than done. He only had 2 hands, but the frame required 4 supports. Balancing everything on his own was nearly impossible, and he failed many times. The wooden beams kept falling apart, and frustration grew with each attempt. But no matter how difficult it was, he refused to give up in anger. He kept trying, tying the supports tighter, and experimenting with different methods. Then he finally succeeded in securing the frame. It was a small victory. With the frame in place, his simple residence was slowly taking shape. However, he knew there was still a long way to go. He could not just sleep out in the open, exposed to the cold and wild animals. Unfortunately, he had no choice for now. He had to endure another sleepless night under the sky, waiting for morning. As the sun rose, he finally managed to complete his shelter. It was basic, rough, and far from comfortable, but it was a place to stay. Just as he was about to rest, something unexpected happened. That a system window suddenly appeared in front of him. Ed was completely caught off guard when the crafting system appeared before him. His crafting proficiency had increased. Up until now, he had thought of himself as someone untalented, weak, and completely outmatched by the world around him. But seeing the system recognize his crafting skills made him realize something important, that he had a hidden talent. As a noble, Ed had never needed to do manual labor. His life had been focused on magic and noble etiquette, so he never had the chance to discover his true strengths. But now, the system revealed that his dexterity was actually his best stat. His handiness had even reached level 4, meaning he was far more skilled with his hands than with magic. His stomach was still growling. With this in mind, he decided to put his dexterity to good use and crafted a simple harpoon which is used for fishing or hunting, but it had no sharpness. He had no proper tools, but his hands worked efficiently. When the weapon was finally finished, he held it tightly, knowing this could be his key to survival. But even though he had a weapon, his biggest problem remained was hunger. He had not eaten properly for 2 whole days. On top of that, he had exhausted himself by working hard to build his shelter. Realistically, he should have collapsed from starvation now. But instead, something kept pushing him forward. Maybe it was the sheer desperation of his situation. Or maybe it was just his strong will to survive. His body craved real food. He wanted meat, something substantial that could fill his empty stomach. With that goal in mind, he made his way to the river with his harpoon. At first, fishing was difficult, but after a few tries, luck was finally on his side. He managed to catch fish. Without wasting another second, he started preparing the fish by magic ignition, eager to finally eat something real and regain his strength. Ed had been focused on one thing, that was surviving until the school year started in a week. If he could just last that long, he believed he could manage the rest. School might bring its own challenges, but compared to the struggle of finding food and shelter, it would at least provide some stability. However, just as he was settling into this mindset, something completely unexpected happened. Someone approached him. When he turned to see who it was, he was completely stunned. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the person standing before him. A beautiful girl with long blonde hair. Ed was so busy trying to survive that he had completely forgotten about her. But now, seeing her in front of him, memories of the game flooded back into his mind. She was not just any student. She was the Princess of Phenia, a powerful and influential figure within the academy and more importantly main character of the story. But more importantly, she was the very person who had once played a key role in his downfall. In the game's story, there was a scene where Ed was arrested, humiliated, and nearly expelled from the academy. And it was all because of her. She was the one who had taken action against him, ensuring that he was removed from the dormitory and cast aside. She questioned him with crossed arms and sharp eyes. "You still have not left this place." Ed Roth Taylor was known as a villain who appeared at the very beginning of the game. Using his status as a noble, he shamelessly flirted with the protagonist's childhood friend, only to be punished for his behavior. However, instead of reflecting on his actions, he became consumed by resentment. In an act of revenge, he tampered with the protagonist's entrance exam for Sylvania Academy. But his scheme failed miserably when he was caught by none other than Phenia Elias Kloll, the third princess of the Kloll Empire, who had secretly taken the entrance exam while hiding her identity. She was widely known as the Princess of Phenia, and her abilities were far beyond ordinary. Phenia possessed a powerful skill called insight, which allowed her to detect lies and hidden schemes. The moment she laid eyes on Ed, she exposed every single one of his falsehoods. He tried to make excuses, but it was useless. His lies crumbled before her, and his disgrace was made public. As a result, he was expelled from the dormitory and left with nothing. His reputation was completely ruined, and everyone at the academy despised him. Now, Ed found himself in an unexpected and unfortunate situation. Of all the people he could have met, it had to be her. Phenia stood before him with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze piercing through him. She leaned slightly forward, looking down at him with an expression full of judgment and authority. With a stern voice, she demanded an explanation. "What are you doing here? Are you telling me the academy has not expelled you?" Ed felt a wave of panic. As he quickly stood up, trying to come up with a response. He could not afford to make a mistake now. With urgency in his voice, he blurted out, "It is just, I am still a student here. But I was still chased out of the dorms." Phineas stood tall with her brows furrowed. She pointed directly and spoke in a sharp, commanding voice. "I will keep my words short." Then, without hesitation, she shouted, "Leave! I can't stand to see a shameless person like you around this school. I will talk to the academic department and personally request your expulsion. For the crime of committing a dishonorable act as a student of the academy. For the crime of setting up a fellow student in an attempt to block their path to a better future." As she spoke with unwavering determination, Ed's thoughts drifted elsewhere. A strong, unpleasant smell reached his nose as he realized what was happening. It is burning smell. He had been starving for 3 days, and now, his precious meal, the fish he had caught with great effort, was turning into charcoal. He stared at Phineas with frustration. "I thought you were going to keep it short." But as much as his burning food was a problem, this situation was an even bigger crisis. This was not just an argument. Phineas, the princess of Phoenicia, had the influence to actually get him expelled. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ed's expression grew serious. He clenched his fists and looked at her. "The sun will set soon. Are not royals always heavily guarded by soldiers?" His voice was steady, but there was a hidden edge to it. Then, with a smirk, he added, "To think that a noble princess would come to an isolated forest like this all alone." Phineas' expression did not waver before she responded. "If you are trying to threaten me, knowing that you do not have escorts, then you will regret it." With a questioning look, he asked, "What do you mean, threaten?" Suddenly, Ed lowered himself onto one knee, placing a hand over his heart. With a firm smile, he spoke confidently. "I am simply trying to thank the princess." Phineas' sharp eyes narrowed with suspicion. Without hesitation, she activated her unique ability. Insight has been activated. She carefully examined Ed's words, expecting to uncover deception. Really he want to thank? The answer from Insight was clear. However, what she found left her stunned. Her ability confirmed the truth. There were no lies in Ed Roth-Taylor's words. Unable to hide her confusion, she stammered in unsteady voice that what? Ed watched her reaction closely, analyzing the situation in his mind. She looked surprised. He knew that the Roth-Taylor family, to which Ed originally belonged, was famous and influential. However, that prestige was built on corruption. The family exploited citizens and even conducted inhumane experiments in the pursuit of eternal life. To the protagonist of the game, the Roth-Taylor family was nothing more than a disgraceful house destined for destruction. In the future, its members would either be imprisoned or executed. But Ed had one advantage: he had already been disowned. As he thought about his situation, a sudden notification appeared before him. A new creation: that burnt fish cannot be consumed. He sighed inwardly. I may be cold and hungry right now, but it is still better than dying. In the long run, this might actually be good. Despite the miserable circumstances, a small smile formed on his lips. I need to convince Phineas like this without lying. If I fail, I will be expelled. No, it would be game over. Looking at the current timeline, he realized something important. Around the time when Ed Roth-Taylor was originally expelled, this should be about a week before the start of the school year. Then another thought struck him. What could be the reason for the princess to be here? Ed slowly stood up from the ground. With a calm but confident voice, he spoke. Having come here without any escort, and wearing simple clothing means you must be completing the class placement test. At that moment, a notification appeared before him. That was a quest of Professor Glass's class placement test. It is a test to find magic beads hidden in the forest. Ed continued speaking, carefully observing her reaction. Professor Glass's test is known to be quite vicious. Of course, since you are the noble Princess Phineas, you will be aiming for the best class, which would be Class A. Phineas' expression darkened as she glared at him. With anger in her voice, she snapped. Are you trying to flatter me? You have not changed a bit. As expected, I should request the Academy to expel you right now. Ed, however, remained unfazed. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His sudden boldness made Phineas widen her eyes in shock. With unwavering confidence, he declared. But without my help, you will never be able to enter Class A. If my words are a lie, then you can have me expelled. He then revealed his knowledge of the test. If you go to the lake at the southeast of the forest, you will find a small grassy island. In the middle of that island stands a giant tree, called Marilda's guardian tree. There, you will find the present I had left. Phinia hesitated for a moment but decided to follow his words. She quickly made her way to the location he had described. Upon reaching the tree, she looked down and spotted something hidden within the roots. She reached out and picked up a large-sized golden bead. As she held the magic bead, her thoughts raced. The Ed Roth Taylor from 3 days ago was definitely a liar and a charlatan. I still vividly remember that sad state. But now, things felt different. However, the Ed Roth Taylor just now. The class placement test has officially ended. On a bright and shiny day at the academy, a man stood before the students with a serious expression. He spoke in a firm voice. Take out the beads you have acquired. This man was Glass, the magic professor. The students eagerly stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with excitement, as they presented what they had found. However, none of them had brought actual magic beads. One student even carried a large-sized egg on his shoulders. Seeing this, Professor Glass's face darkened with frustration. With a hint of anger, he announced, All of you will start from Class F. He continued as his tone was strict. It is important to understand the examiner's intent in a test. This test was not just about finding any magic bead. He then held up beads in his hand and explained. Only those who found beads that were lacking in magic power were able to make it into Class A. Among all of you, only 3 students succeeded in this test. Professor Glass then called out their names. 6. Lortel. Finally, he turned his gaze to Phinia and said, And lastly, the one who found the hidden bead at the guardian tree of Marilda, a bead that had an unusually high amount of magic power. You, the one who discovered it, shall be at the top of the class. Meanwhile, far from the academy, Ed sat by the stream, holding a fishing rod in his hand. His face showed exhaustion as he muttered to himself. It is all burned. I do not even have the strength to use a spear anymore. Ed crafted a crude fishing rod by cutting twigs from a tree trunk with his dagger. He used silk thread from fabric and replaced the needle with a small nail. However, the rod had low durability, and it was difficult to tell if a fish had bitten. Despite its poor quality, his crafting efficiency increased to 1 star. As he dipped the fishing rod into the water, Ed thought about Princess Phinia Elias Kloll, the 3rd princess of the Empire. Since childhood, she had been able to see through flattery and deception, which led to her developing an innate skill called insight. No one could ever escape from her ability to detect lies, meaning Ed had no choice but to provide her with only authentic information. However, this also created a bigger problem. In the original storyline, Phinia, after failing the class placement test and falling into Class F, would undergo significant character development. This journey would eventually earn her the title of the Princess of Love. But now, because of Ed's interference, she had found the golden bead and was placed in Class A instead. This change threatened to alter the entire scenario. If the original story collapsed, the knowledge Ed had from the game would become useless, and he would be in serious trouble. Even though Phinia's new position in Class A could change everything, there was still hope. The top student of the academy, Lucy Merrill, was another key figure in the story. As long as she remained in her role, the future might not be completely lost. However, one thing was certain: Phinia's insight would always reveal the truth. When Phinia held the golden bead in her hand, she spoke with surprise, realizing that Ed Rothstaler had not lied. However, she quickly corrected herself while gripping the bead, stating that this was not a present. Meanwhile, Ed continued his thoughts, trying to understand Phinia's actions. He wondered why she had hidden her identity in the first place. The answer was clear: she was embarrassed by the special treatment she would receive if people knew she was royalty. She wanted to prove herself through her own abilities. Phinia knew that the bead she had found would guarantee her the best results in the test. However, she hesitated because she had not found it on her own. Taking it would feel like cheating, which went against her principles. She then made a choice: she put the bead back and turned away. Ed realized that this was exactly why she would eventually earn the title Princess of Love. It was not a skill or a special ability, but a title she would gain by always choosing the righteous path. By guiding her toward this decision, Ed knew that he had successfully set a trap. He had thrown bait at the princess. Ed recalled his bold statement to Phinia, where he had claimed she would never be able to enter Class A and that if he was lying, she could personally ensure his expulsion. He realized that the truth of his words was not the main issue. Phinia had the unique ability to detect lies, meaning she would always know if someone was being dishonest. However, even if Ed had genuinely believed she would fail, Phinia had enough confidence in herself to prove him wrong. But in the end, Ed had spoken the truth that Phinia did not qualify for Class A. This realization left her frustrated, and with clenched teeth, she declared, "Ed Rostaler, I will keep my eyes on you." Ed understood that this meant she would be watching his every move from now on. However, for the time being, she could no longer take immediate action against him. Meanwhile, Ed focused on his own survival. After struggling with hunger and exhaustion, he finally caught a fish with his crude fishing rod. Overcome with joy, he shouted in excitement that he got it. As he ran back, he reflected on his current situation. He was no longer living in luxury and his life was now a constant struggle. He had to wake up early, travel long distances, and push his body to its limits just to make it through the day. But despite all of that, he had achieved his most important goal. He was still a student at Sylvania Academy. With sweat covering his face, he took a deep breath and looked at the school grounds filled with students. He had made it back at Sylvania Academy. In the grand hall of Academy, students gathered around tables, seated on chairs, as the school opening ceremony began. A voice addressed them, announcing the start of the new semester and encouraging them to enjoy the food while listening. The speaker praised the students for making progress even before the term officially started and mentioned the Academy's academic society. Amidst the ceremony, Ed sat quietly, lost in his thoughts. He could hear the murmurs and whispers of the students around him. Some were shocked to see him there. A boy whispered to his friend, pointing in Ed's direction. A girl responded in disbelief, questioning how he had the nerve to attend the opening ceremony after everything that had happened. She wondered if he truly intended to stay at the academy. Despite the stares and the judgmental whispers, Ed remained calm, focusing on his meal. This moment when he eating warm food in the academy's hall, he felt like a victory. He decided to savor it slowly, as it was his reward for enduring hardship. Another student recognized him and muttered his name in surprise. But Ed paid no attention. He continued to eat, knowing his true goal. He was no longer concerned with their opinions. His aim was clear: to graduate from Sylvania Academy, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And then he overheard a group of female students whispering nearby. One of them recognized him and commented on how he had looked pitiful during the entrance exam. Another girl, however, noticed something different about him. She pointed out that, despite everything, he ate his food with proper manners, unlike before. Ed ignored their words and focused on his own thoughts. He had no grand ambitions, he only wanted to graduate from the academy peacefully. He had already been through enough. Meanwhile, the conversation among the girls shifted to something more exciting. One of them eagerly mentioned that the head chef of Ophelis had prepared special desserts, and they should all go try them together. She also suggested they catch up on what had happened during the vacation. Another girl, Clara, turned to her friend Annis and asked what she thought. Annis agreed, and they happily planned to enjoy the treats. As they got up to leave, one of them glanced back at Ed and muttered that he seemed like a completely different person. But Ed only wished for nothing to happen, just a quiet school life where he could avoid unnecessary trouble. The first day of school at Sylvania had begun, and the students sat in their chairs, listening as someone addressed them with excitement. It was a new semester, and he was eager to see the changes in the students and the improvements made by the Sylvania Academic Society. Ed, however, thought with disappointment about what had happened earlier in the dean's office. He remembered that on the very first day, he was almost expelled. He had not expected Phinia to tell the dean anything about him, but from the way the cranky old man was smiling while speaking, it did not seem like she had said anything bad. In the end, he barely managed to avoid expulsion. With sharp eyes, he reminded himself to be careful so that the story would not stray from the original path. As he thought about his situation, a screen suddenly appeared in front of him, displaying information about his combat abilities. His rank was shown as a novice fighter, and his specialty was the bow. His bow proficiency was at a low level, which was not very impressive. He continued reading and saw that his life skills were honed for survival, and his magic training was appropriate for a student of the Faculty of Magic. Though he was not particularly strong, he knew that he had to make the best of his abilities if he wanted to survive in Sylvania. Ed aimed his arrow carefully at the rabbit, focusing on his target. The moment he released the string, the arrow shot forward and embedded into the rabbit's body. He watched as the animal collapsed, then thought about his fighting style. To get the best out of both magic and physical skills, a bow was the perfect weapon. As his life skills improved and he learned to craft better quality arrows, he would eventually be able to cast spirit or magic formulas onto them, making them even stronger. He pitched up that arrow, holding it in his hand as he continued thinking. Of course, using spirit formulas was still beyond his abilities for now, but he knew he would reach that level with time. Just as he was lost in thought, his eyes caught sight of a girl sitting on the ground under a large tree. An open book was placed in front of her, and several closed books were scattered nearby. She was holding another book in her hand, completely focused on reading. Ed's thoughts shifted as he observed her, wondering about the realm of his own talent compared to someone like her. The girl's name was Janica Failover, a second-year student and the top of her class. She was known as a genius spirit sorcerer, someone far beyond his level in magic. Suddenly, she lifted her head and looked straight at him. Her eyes locked onto his, and without hesitation she spoke. "So you are the amusing guy Marilda was talking about?" Ed was taken aback, not expecting her to say that. Before he could react, her eyes gleamed with excitement, and she spoke again. "Ed Roth-Taylor, am I right? I am Janica Failover. I am in my second year, same as you. You can call me Janica." Ed felt a wave of confusion. He had no idea how she had even gotten all the way here without him noticing. One moment she had been sitting quietly, and the next, she was suddenly addressing him like they already knew each other. Janica stood confidently in front of Ed, a firm smile on her face. She could see the surprise in his eyes and spoke. Was he surprised because she knew about him? She explained that this forest was the territory of Marilda, a high-ranking spirit, and that she had heard a lot about him from her. Ed looked at her with curiosity and asked if the master of this forest had really told her about him. Janica nodded with a convincing smile and told him that Marilda was quite nosy. Since her attention was everywhere, it was only natural that she would notice an unwanted visitor like him. Ed's thoughts spun with surprise as he held the rabbit in one hand and his bow in the other. I am an unwanted visitor? He had killed many creatures in this forest and had cut down so many trees. Did that really make him an intruder in Marilda's eyes? Before he could say anything, Janica suddenly stepped closer, her face only inches from his. The moment made him feel the sweat on his face, but she only smirked and told him not to worry about the small stuff. It was the natural order of things for creatures in the forest to hunt and eat each other. Even Marilda, the great spirit of the forest, was not bothered by something like that. Ed felt his face heat up as Janica's sudden closeness made him flustered. He clenched his teeth and smirked, throwing out a teasing remark. So even the huge wild wolf has a tender heart. For a moment, Janica looked confused, her eyes widening slightly at his words. Then, as realization hit her, she laughed and asked, "It is unexpected, right?" She took a deep breath and told him there was something she wanted to show him. With a grin, she asked, "Is not it just cute and adorable?" Janica held out her hands, revealing a small spirit resting within them. Her smile was firm and filled with confidence as she spoke. She had signed a contract with the spirit just yesterday, the moment she saw him. Then, with a curious expression, she asked if Ed wanted to try touching him. Ed stared at the spirit in surprise, his thoughts racing. Was this really a spirit? If he wanted to be friends with Janica, all he had to do was respond at the right time. But something held him back. Instead, he spoke honestly, telling her that he did not know what she meant. He could not see spirits. Or rather, he had never been able to. Janica's eyes widened in shock as she asked if he really could not see spirits. Ed nodded, then turned away, walking in the opposite direction. Without looking back, he simply replied that he could not. Anyway, he had only come to the forest to get food, so he needed to get going now. As he walked away, his expression turned serious. He reminded himself that only by following the original storyline could he gain an informational advantage. Janica Failover was an important figure in the original story. If he wanted to stay on track, she was someone he must never get too close to. Janica stood in place, watching his back. Her mind replayed his words from earlier, when he had looked at her with a teasing smile and said that even a huge wild wolf had a tender heart. Janica gently touched the large, glowing white wolf-like spirit beside her. Confusion filled her voice as she spoke to the spirit, Marilda. It was just as Marilda had said, that Ed was truly a fascinating guy. No matter how much she thought about it, she was certain that he really could not see spirits. But who exactly was he? With a small sigh, she lay down on the spirit's thick fur, letting its warmth comfort her. Marilda sat calmly on the ground, unmoving, as Janica continued to talk. She had tried so hard to be kind to Ed, yet all he had said in response was yep. What was that even supposed to mean? She had expected something more, but instead, he had been so distant. Janica spoke again, this time with a hint of sadness. Well, it was not like she would never see him again. She could always find out more about him in the future, right? Meanwhile, Ed had other things on his mind. He thought about the long distance between his shelter and the student area. It was not close at all. Every day, he had to leave at dawn and run at full speed just to make it on time. Simply commuting to school had become something ridiculous that, without realizing it, was increasing his physical stats. But if he truly wanted to win the scholarship, he would have to study even more diligently. Despite his difficult situation, he did everything he could to keep up. He used a burned stick to write on a stone slab, making notes and studying whenever he had the chance. He borrowed books from the student library, trying to learn as much as possible. On his way home, he washed his sweaty clothes, making sure they were clean for the next day. Every single day was a struggle, but he had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Ed Rothtailor's mind heavy with worry. He glanced at the clothes and thought with concern if they would be dry by morning. His day had been long, but it was far from over. He still needed to check his firewood, drinking water, and food supply for tomorrow. As he reached for the jerky, a frown crossed his face. He thought with confusion why the beef jerky had a fishy smell. He sighed, knowing that his night would be short. He could only sleep for 4 hours because of all these worries. But that was not what truly bothered him the most. Among all these, he felt someone's presence behind him. He felt frustration because Janica was following him and watching his every move. He finally stopped and turned to face her, his voice sharp as he asked how long she was going to keep following him. At first, her eyes widened in shock, but then she spoke with panic, realizing that he had known she was behind him the whole time. He had really noticed her. Ed shouted with anger, his voice echoing through the silent forest. It would be stranger if he had not. Did she not know who he was? He was Ed Rothtailor, the worst hooligan to exist. He repeated his name loudly as if it should explain everything. Then he demanded to know why she kept hanging around him. Janica did not flinch at his anger. Instead, she looked at him with a firm smile and spoke calmly. That was just what other people said about him, was it not? She did not even know him yet. Ed observed Janica, his sharp eyes studying her closely. He thought that this was exactly the kind of person she was. Janica Failover might seem naive and foolish on the outside, but she was actually strong-willed and independent. However, knowing what was waiting for her in the future, he could not simply smile at her like she was just another person. No, Janica Failover was the final boss of Act 1. She was the only person who ever smiled at him, Ed Rothtailor, the so-called worst hooligan. His thoughts darkened as he clenched his eyes with frustration. He reminded that he was a villain, a scumbag. With that thought, he looked at her seriously and asked if she could do him a favor, since destiny had brought them together. Janica's eyes gleamed with excitement as she clenched her fists eagerly. She asked with curiosity what kind of favor he needed. Without hesitation, Ed explained his situation. As she could see, he was a mess. He had been disowned by his family and was in serious trouble. Then, with a confident tone, he asked her if she could lend him some money. He quickly added that it was not like he would not pay her back. That was what friends were for, right? He was only borrowing it for a little while. Then, without shame, he asked how much she had. After speaking to Janica, Ed thought every year she received a scholarship for being the top of her class, but that was not just proof of her intelligence. Her background was painfully poor. Without that scholarship, she would not be able to stay in school or move forward in her education. She was the daughter of a small rancher, struggling just to get by. Her greatest weakness was money. They stood facing each other in the middle of the quiet forest. The trees swayed slightly. Janica hesitated before speaking. She apologized, clearly unable to help him. Ed watched her, his thoughts sharp. That was it. Janica Failover was cut out. 3 days later, Ed found deep in the forest, holding a rabbit in his hands. He thought with frustration about everything that had happened. He did not feel great about the way things had turned out, but he was determined not to get involved with important characters anymore. He needed to be careful, to make sure the story did not stray from its original path. As he approached his small shelter, he instinctively glanced inside. The moment his eyes landed on what was inside, he froze. He fell on ground with shock. Then, in a breaking voice, he shouted in panic, unable to believe what he was seeing. Inside his shelter, peacefully sleeping, was a girl. But she was no ordinary girl. His thoughts raced as he looked at her. In terms of importance, she was even more significant than Janica. She was someone admired by both classmates and professors alike. A rare genius. The most powerful character in the failed swordsman of Sylvania, Lucy Merrill. Ed's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of it. Why the hell was she sleeping in his shelter? Ed sat frozen. He could not understand what Lucy Merrill was doing in this remote mountain valley. She had no reason to be here, yet there she was, stretching her body as if waking up from a peaceful nap. Before he could gather his thoughts, she spoke casually while sitting on the ground. Her tone was annoyed as she complained that he was being too loud and that she could not sleep because of it. Ed's face broke into a cold sweat as he stammered while asking what he had even done to disturb her. Lucy shook her head and denied that it was him. Then, without hesitation, she pointed behind him and spoke in an eerily calm voice. It was not him making the noise, but it was the massive wolf behind him. A wolf so big, it was the size of a house. Ed's entire body stiffened. His eyes widened in shock as he slowly turned his head, afraid of what he might see. Lucy continued speaking. She told him that the wolf had been talking to him. It was asking him to save Janica at all costs. Lucy had only been at the camp for 2 days, but things had already started to change. Ed held a rope in one hand and rested an axe on his shoulder, ready to get to work. He tried to convince himself that nothing significant would come from this. But it did not take long for him to realize how foolish that thought was. The next challenge was the joint combat training, a quest that involved one-on-one combat exercises. It was a mock battle designed to be as safe as possible, so most students used fake weapons instead of real ones. However, that did not mean it was easy. The students participating were some of the most skilled and powerful in the academy. Among them were well-known names were the benevolent Princess Phenia, the golden daughter Lortel, the spirit sorcerer Janica, the slothful Lucy, and the wicked Clebius. The list went on, filled with talented fighters. But no matter how many strong opponents there were, the most important person in this event was the protagonist, the failing swordsman, Taylor McClure. Ed's eyes gleamed as he watched Taylor gripping his sword tightly, preparing for his match. He thought if Taylor's turn was next. But he already knew the outcome. There was no need to pay close attention to the fights because the results had already been decided. The first-year students, the same as the protagonist Taylor, would dominate the matches. Except for exactly one person. Suddenly, Janica Failover, a second-year student, called out to Ed with excitement. Ed turned his head toward her, feeling a wave of frustration. He could not believe how happy she looked after the embarrassing moment when he had asked her for money just days ago. Janica spoke eagerly, announcing that the list of matches had been released. She held up the paper in her hands. But Ed's thoughts drifted elsewhere. Unlike Lucy, who was from the cat family, Janica was definitely from the dog family. With a deep breath, Ed crossed his arms and responded flatly that he was not really interested. Janica looked at him with a firm smile and asked why he was not curious about his own match. Her words hit him suddenly. His eyes widened in shock as he realized. He thought, wait a minute. I have to fight as well? His gaze dropped to the paper in Janica's hands, and his mind raced. In the original storyline, Ed Roth Taylor was already expelled by this point. Who could possibly be his opponent? Janica chuckled and pointed at the paper to look. The moment he saw the name, his face turned pale. Cold sweat covered his skin as he whispered in disbelief, no way. At that moment, Taylor McClure, the protagonist, stepped forward. He stood tall. With sharp eyes, he placed a fist over his heart and declared with determination that he would perform to the best of his ability. Ed felt a small smile form on his lips as he thought. Right now, it did not matter who his opponent was. What truly mattered was Taylor. He needed to keep his attention on him. Even though this was a world beyond the screen, he had lived as Taylor for so long that it felt personal. His mind drifted back to the countless times he had played through Taylor's journey. He remembered the screen flashing game over. Then the question appeared, do you want to play again? Yes or no? Over and over, he had chosen yes. Ed continued his thoughts, recalling all the different endings he had seen. From miserable failures and hopeless bad endings to the true endings that left a deep impact, he had experienced it all. There was not a single path that was easy. Each one was filled with struggles. His fists clenched tightly as sadness washed over him. His eyes filled with tears, but he held them back. He had already decided to take care of his own life and focus on his own survival. But still, deep inside, he was cheering for Taylor. Just as he was lost in thought, a voice suddenly rang out from the speakers. It echoed across the training grounds, calling for a student to step forward. That he was repeating the announcement. Was there a student named Lucy Merrill? Please come up to the arena once she was ready for the practice match. Ed looked around in confusion, wondering where Lucy had gone. She had disappeared just as her match was being announced. Then, the voice from the speakers echoed again, calling her name. It was time for the duel. First year, top of the class, Lucy Merrill versus Taylor McClure. Ed's thoughts raced as he watched the two opponents step into the arena. Taylor, the protagonist of this world, was born to be a swordsman. Yet up until now, he had never even held a sword before in his life. Despite that, the moment he swung his weapon for the first time, he effortlessly cut through Lucy's lightning-fast magic. Lucy's eyes widened in shock. She had expected her spell to land without fail, but Taylor had blocked it. Caught off guard, as Taylor quickly closed the distance between them. Reacting instinctively, Lucy struck him with Lightning Strike, an intermediate-level magic spell. A powerful burst of energy surged forward, overwhelming Taylor completely. But then, the unexpected happened. Because she had used the spell beyond the allowed level, Lucy was immediately disqualified. The match was over. Despite being overpowered, Taylor was declared the winner. He had officially become the first person to defeat Lucy Merrill in a duel. Ed clenched his fists, overwhelmed with emotion, and tears streamed down his cheeks. It was a legendary moment. Then, another voice boomed across the arena to announce to start the next match between them. As the battle began, Taylor thought while making a punch of his hand he was ready to go. But before he could even make a move, Lucy attacked first. She unleashed a powerful surge of energy with both hands. A strong stream of force struck Taylor directly, knocking him off his feet. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Janika's eyes widened in shock as she watched Taylor. Feel like the match had ended in an instant. But unlike her, Ed had a smile on his face. As he looked at the scene before him, he thought to himself, it is already over? He guessed Taylors can't win against the top of the class. No wonder. What was the point of running at a mage like her barehanded? He knew Taylor's story well. His entire life had been a series of hardships and struggles. A simple country boy, an underperforming student, and a failure in the eyes of many. Since the moment he started school, he had never earned a single impressive grade. No one acknowledged him. As the crowd watched the match unfold, they all assumed it was over. Some pitied Taylor, seeing him as helpless in this unfair situation. But Ed knew better. Even in the face of despair, Taylor McClure never gave up. And just then, Taylor slowly pushed himself back up. His body was covered in scratches, his movements were weak, but his grip on his sword was firm. His determination had not faded. Seeing this, Ed's sharp smile grew wider. Cheer him, that was right. Taylors can do it. Taylor clenched his sword tightly, and with all his remaining strength, he rushed toward Lucy and shouted Lucy Merrill's name. Lucy's eyes widened in surprise as Taylor charged at her. Ed, watching from the sidelines, smirked and thought, and here, Lucy will use lightning magic. But something unexpected happened. Instead of using lightning magic, Lucy suddenly summoned a powerful gust of wind. The force of her spell sent Taylor flying backward. He screamed as he was thrown across the arena, crashing into a pillar with a sharp, echoing sound. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Ed's eyes widened in shock. Not lightning magic, but instead she used wind magic? The arena fell silent for a moment before the speakers echoed through the air. Lucy Merrill was the victor. Taylor lay down, completely defeated. His body was motionless. Ed looked at him, his mind racing. Taylor was lost.